Share your screen with your audience. All right, you guys. January 24th, 2026, and I'm looking for a little bit of help here to see if I get audio okay. We are all new to live streams, and for anybody and everybody who has joined us or is watching this recorded, we appreciate it very much. I am still waiting for confirmation that we have audio. My partner Slav says, hey, all. Hey, Slav, can you confirm to me that we have audio, please? Okay, I just got a confirmation we've got audio. January 24th, 2026. And guys, we have a snowstorm and an ice storm, depending on where you're at. And this is going to be the worst one of 2026 so far. And, you know, one of the things that I remember, and I know you couldn't tell it by looking, but I was 11 years old in 1978 when the blizzard of 1978 happened. It is kind of famous here in the Midwest. And it just like disabled everything. But I have one memory of that I want to share with you. And this kind of goes to some of the topics in the ebook that I wrote called Get Your Defensive House in Order, which, by the way, is being revised with the help of a 30-year firearms industry writer. And if I was to share his name with you, he would, you would know it. I don't have the right to do that yet at this point. But one of the things I remember from 1978 was everything was just disabled. There was just, we shoveled our way up to our detached garage and we opened the overhead door and it was just solid wall of snow. There was no daylight. And the thing that has stuck in my mind ever since then was a few days after the storm happened and before, there was anything like, mobility for anything except, snowmobiles and the most resilient four-wheel drives. Our telephone rang and a neighbor across the street had gone out with his wife and daughter, to go out on foot, to go to the store and get some things. And they came back and they walked in on a home invasion in their home. And this is like the worst possible circumstances for anybody to get around anywhere. And anyway, he got stabbed with a screwdriver through the hand as the home invasion abruptly ended, I guess, and the intruders left. And what I vividly remember about that was, 911 was called, and it was a very, very, very long time before anyone, as far as law enforcement got there. And in fact, to get to that particular house and on our street, the officers had to walk from a main street because everything was impassable. And the intruders got away and were never, found, or, they had very, very little clues even to go on. And with a storm coming like what we've got, and having, authored the book, Get Your Defensive House in Order, I'm inclined to share that with you because, when we get snowed in, when we get iced in, and, like almost nothing is moving, just remember, almost nothing is moving. And you can be very alone, frankly. And help can take a very, very long time to get to you. So that's just one of the things that, comes to my mind today as we got this, the snow and this ice thing approaching. And we're going to talk a little bit about Get Your Defensive House in Order, the revised and the updated version, and, kind of what all that's about as well. And we've got some of the BH team that are watching. Hey, you guys. Wanted to let you know that if you have any questions, and we sure hope that folks will ask questions or, present some subject matter that you'd like some input about, you can do that on the chat. And there's another way you can do that as well. If you would like to email us your question, you can do that at BHSpringSolutions@gmail.com. We do have staff personnel who are monitoring BHSpringSolutions@gmail.com, and they will be able to get to me your questions here throughout the live stream. So anyway, welcome, folks, you folks who are BH veterans and you are here. We appreciate you very, very much. Thank you for following along with us for the last 11 years, just about. So yes, the layest on the forecast here for central Indiana is we may be looking at 12 inches, and the confidence level in that number is still, they're not very confident about it. It could be more here in some places. It could be less in some places, and brutal cold that we're going to be dealing with as well. So we wish everyone to stay safe and don't take any chances that you don't have to take in traveling while this is going on. And remember that bad guys don't stop their vocation when they encounter bad weather. And in some ways, like I was explaining to you about the incident that happened across the street when I was a child, in some ways they can thrive on it, and they're opportunists. And one of the reasons why we and I want to involve an industry writer, the particular one that we are, is because we are living in, and I think most people can agree with this, we are living in what I call an enhanced threat environment today. And all you really have to do is turn on your news. But one of the reasons that we say that is, number one, the prevalence of firearms in the hands of people who should not be having firearms at all. And also the prevalence of, and the wide availability of, like at everychinagate.com, of body armor that is quite effective. And there was recently an incident where a couple, this was in the news, and a couple encountered, in the middle of the night, pounding on their door, two individuals on the porch announcing themselves as police and looking, astoundingly like police with, body armor and rifles. And that's how they announced themselves. And the folks would not open the door, and they started shooting through the door. And these two individuals, did check out on this life on that front porch. And, it again brings back an exclamation point to how we are living in an enhanced threat environment. In other words, the threats, and I'm going to go so far as, to use police officer speak, bad guys, are working in more sophisticated ways today than I think, definitely at any time in our lives. And the question becomes today, and the premise of Get Your Defensive House in Order is, am I willing to outthink and outplan the enhanced threat environment? And that's really what it comes down to. And I will give you a hint. Outthinking and outplanning today's enhanced threat environment does not necessarily mean I have to go buy 10 more firearms, or I have to even go buy one. What it really comes down to is this, and I want to just share with you some statistics real quickly that are in the book. And we'll just cite one particular year, 2019. The FBI reported 316 justifiable homicides involving a private citizen using a firearm. That is, good guy stopping bad guy. 316 for the year, compared to 9,610 criminal gun homicides. That's bad guys did not die. Good guy died. And so what that comes down to is that when crime is committed and someone dies by firearm, 316 divided by 9,610 guys is just shy of 3.3%, which also means 96.7% of those instances, an innocent victim died, and 3.3% of the time, the victim successfully defended the situation and was justified in doing so. So I would ask you to pause, just for a second. And one of the things I would suggest is that encapsulates the reason why Get Your Defensive House in Order for the gun owning community is a necessary book of strategies and tactics and mindsets. And the reason is because, guys, when somebody dies, 97% of the time it's the good guy dying, and 3% of the time it's a bad guy who got stopped by a good guy with a gun. And that is in a country that has, we're told, more firearms than people. And you would not think that it would be this way, but as we dig deeper into the statistics, and as we dig deeper in, and it goes in the book, what we find in the statistics and what we find in the numbers is that in those 97% of the times where the good guy dies, how many firearms he owned, if he owned one or 1,000 or zero, was a non-factor, because his firearms didn't come into the picture. In other words, this happened and it was over with before there was even time to even deholster or get to the firearm, wherever that would happen to be. So that puts an exclamation point on, am I willing to outplan? Am I willing to outthink this enhanced threat environment? And there are very, very few things that can be said that universally hold true all the time in defensive situations. But there are some fundamentals, there are some principles that are always a plus, that are always a strength. And that's really what Get Your Defensive House in Order is about. The current book is available at BHSpringSolutions.com. And one of the things that we want to do is, if you are part of this live stream today, and if you do order that book at BHSpringSolutions.com, we want you to make a note. You'll have an opportunity on your order to make a note that I heard about this on the live stream. And here's what we're going to do is we're going to make sure that you receive also the updated version when that's available, the revised and updated version. And that is an ebook. It arrives to you immediately. You're able to download it. You can print it out, which I think a lot of guys really like to do. It's not an excessively long read, but it does get to the important fundamentals quickly. And I'm not going to tell you that the ideas in this book are the most saleable or the most marketable. They're not. It's far easier for us to, pay a lot more attention to, marketing for, this faster rate of fire or this lighter trigger or, whatever it is, the next best wonder gun. And I think a lot of that is a sincere desire to feel safer. The problem is uh, as we all know, I think feelings sometimes lie, and feeling safe is not enough. And I don't care how many firearms you purchase, none of them are going to make you feel safe if you're not prepared um, to use them to stop an attack. And one of the mindsets of having your defensive house in order is an active defense is actually a counterattack, using strategies and what we call force multipliers. And you, and I'm going to give you an example of, we think of, this word force multipliers, and I think it is applicable. There was a gentleman that, and this is, you can find this on video. I believe it was in California, and he was walking. He had the the kind of house where you sort of got the attached garage. It's kind of like more the front of the house, and you walk around the attached garage to your entry door, and this is what he did. And he gets to the entry door, and there is a gentleman behind him he didn't know was there, who puts a gun in his back. On the other side of his entry door is his wife and baby. And it startled him when he felt something in his back, and it was a firearm. It was a pistol. And he abruptly turned around, and when he, instantly when he saw what was going on, he had a Starbucks iced tea, or I believe, in his hand, and he just threw it right at the guy. And then he deholstered, and as this guy was, running down his sidewalk, as soon as the events went off script, and what I mean is off script according to what this perpetrator had envisioned was going to happen. As soon as things went off, however he had imaged and envisioned this was going to go down, he ran, and he was being followed by bullets down the sidewalk. And then he gets down the sidewalk, and guess what? He's got a buddy with him who pops up, and apparently both of them left. Guys, that situation could have turned out very, very, very badly, especially for the for the whole family. But it teaches an important fundamental that is stressed in Get Your Defensive House in Order, and that is your ability to survive and defend or counterattack when there is an attack is directly in proportion to your ability to make something happen that the perpetrator does not see coming. In other words, people who do these things have, a vision. I sort of liken it to, when I'm shooting basketball, and I'm shooting a free throw. And before I do, I kind of get this vision of the flight of the ball and a vision of the ball going over the front of the rim, and having that kind of vision of what is going to happen. And it would be not realistic to think that bad guys operate very much differently from that. In other words, they have a plan, they know it's going to happen. The victim does not typically know it's going to happen, which means the victim is always at least one step behind, and usually a lot more, when something happens. And this is the reason for that bad, 97-3, ratio of good guys, bad guys, dead, is typically you don't see this kind of thing coming. And the element of surprise is something that they highly value, and they expect to control a situation very, very, very quickly. And the gentleman's there at his front door with a gun in his back. Was that iced tea a force multiplier or not? My argument is it was a big force multiplier. It enabled him. It was something he could do to make something happen that the bad guy did not plan for, was not prepared for to have happen. there's another story, and this one here is fairly recent, actually. And it's a woman who lives alone on a 911 call. She's in her bedroom. She knows somebody's in her house. This guy is actually being loud. And he gets to her bedroom, and she took him out with her firearm. Was her firearm a force multiplier or not? Of course. We have to, I think, in today's enhanced threat environment, we have to think force multipliers more than ever before. And I tell a story. I like to, and by the way, one of the rules of YouTube is we can't show any firearms on a live stream. So I'm not going to be doing that. But, one of my rationales, and I know this sounds crazy, but, everybody will tell you that, a 25 ACP pocket pistol is not you'll hear everything from that's not a man stopper to, you'll just hear a lot of, well-intentioned expertise about, why that's not a good choice. Well, I make it a choice, and it's not my only choice. It's not the only thing I have access to. However, I have found that from a pants pocket, I can remove my hand and I can have a first shot off at about 0.3 seconds, sometimes 0.4. I can do it very reflexively without a lot of practice. And it is an ability to make something happen extremely, extremely fast. Now, am I expecting to stop a threat or an attack with a 25 ACP handgun? Of course not. But my rationale is it's at least as good as a glass of iced tea. The ability to make something happen and quickly. One of the or a couple of the fundamentals is to be able to be extremely reflexive with your tools, fast and right now. And I believe there's no substitutes for those skills and those abilities. So, if as another example, would I deploy a 25 ACP out of a pocket? Well, if the situation looks like I can raise that hand out of my pocket and go straight to something that's more persuasive, well, I've got that option, and it's not going to slow me down, the fact that I have other options. We have a good friend who, and this gets really right into the subject of, manual safety or no manual safety. And I know that this is a sort of a contentious thing, and I'm not trying to make in any way an argument moment for anybody out of this, but we have a dear friend who purchased, he's a retired law enforcement officer, and he purchased one of our drop-in manual safeties for Glock pistols. And he found out about that product from a former colleague who is, and this colleague of his is getting close to retirement age. And his colleague had a situation where he lost control of his primary sidearm, which was a Glock, and it was pointed at him, and the trigger was pulled, and it had our drop-in manual safety on it. He was able to get to the backup plan. And by the way, guys, take a note. Every police officer I've ever met, every department I've ever spent time with because of our Glock safety, our drop-in manual safety for Glock pistols, every police officer is carrying at least one backup firearm, and a lot of them carry two. And, that 97-3 ratio, your statistical probability of losing or having a handgun stolen or taken from you is exponentially higher than the notion that you'll ever use it to defend yourself or anyone. And so planning for what happens if I don't see it coming, what happens if, two or three, get me from behind, and because I don't have eyes 360 degrees around my head, that nice big primary sidearm, and my wallet, are fairly easy things to find, which, are predictable for what, somebody would likely be going for. And, I'm going to, maybe this is a fess up moment for me. There are two things in this world I can tell you that specifically bother me to think about. And one of them is not being at the top of the food chain in my environment, it really bothers me to think about being dinner for something that thinks I'm food. And the second thing is having one of my own firearms pointed at me, and that's the last thing that I ever see. And those two things specifically, I'm going to tell you, they cause me real concern. And so anyway, this police officer is forbidden from talking about, the incident that he had with us, because it did turn into a police action shooting involving death. And however, that drop in manual safety did buy him enough time to access the backup plan and stay alive and solve the problem. Massad Ayub talks about a study that a police department did years ago, that they took all of the personnel of the department, and these were the non-firearms carrying personnel, and they brought them in one at a time, and they asked them there was a firearm on a table that had no manual safety, and a firearm on a table that did have a manual safety. And these were, your secretarial staff, your janitorial staff, your office people, your non-firearms carrying department personnel. So they used this as a cross section of the public, and the average time that it took the person to pull the trigger on a non-manual safety firearm was under 2 seconds. And with a manual safety, it was right around 17 seconds. There was about 15 seconds average that manual safety required before the person was able to figure out where's the go switch. And that, is something to really think about. Our friend, who is a great friend, and I wouldn't be surprised if he's watching this today, who shared this story about his friend, the current law enforcement officer whose life was essentially saved by a manual safety on his Glock. He came to us looking for the same thing, for his own Glock pistol, and very convinced of the value of it, and that this gentleman owed a lot to that device. And it is I don't know how exactly to put this so it doesn't sound weird, but I'm going to tell you, there's more gratification in that than if we had sold 10,000 of something. To know that something that we have that involves tactical safety, and that is actually a term I believe that we coined some years ago, made a difference. And that family, has a husband and a father, who is still doing his life today, because when his firearm was pointed at him and the trigger was pulled, it did not fire. And he had acquired, that department does not have our manual safety on their firearms. He acquired that in and of himself, by himself, put it on his Glock himself. We have adapter kits for a couple, 2 or 3 different kind of holsters, common law enforcement holsters, and he had modified his duty holster, and so that it was able to be used with the manual safety on the Glock pistol, and it did what it is designed to do. And that manual safety was designed by our chief weapons and modifications designer, Leon Hubert. He was also FN's chief designer for 35 years, owner of RDIH in Liège, Belgium for 28 years. And in 2007, he designed a contract job for FN, which became the FN S9, which, a couple of very minor modifications became today's 509. And while he was designing, what I think is probably, hands down a better, quote, Glock pistol, it's not a Glock pistol. It's a pistol of its own. while he was doing that, and the objective was, we were told it was to one up Glock, in just about every possible way. And, I've seen a lot of things online that, you guys comparing an FNS9 to a Glock head to head. And generally it seems like the FNS9 does just usually, in the opinion of the presenter, edge out, a Glock pistol on a lot of different subjects and a lot of different subject matter. Well, while he was doing that, he came up with a way to interrupt what happens in a Glock pistol with an addition in place of the back cover plate, a manual safety. And the one of the things I'm going to share with you, because I think this is it says a lot about Leon Hubert. It says, hopefully it says something good about BHSpringSolutions. I think it also applies to BH veterans by and large, and that's a real compliment. But when Slav and I were in Liège a couple of times ago, we were at Leon Hubert's house, and we sat down at his table, and on his table was a local newspaper. And in the newspaper, I don't, once upon a time, I was very fluent in French, and I was able to read enough of this newspaper, which is in French because it's in Belgium. I was able to read enough of this to figure out, what was going on here. And then he, finished the story and told us, and it was basically, a man with his Glock pistol had come home, and I guess apparently, laid his pistol down somewhere, whatever. He had a couple small children, and I don't remember if it was one of the children who died or both of them died. But the thing that I will never, ever, ever forget was the level of burden, I would call it, I guess, in Leon's eyes and expression, and how he said this. And his words were, "My invention would have stopped this." And which is, a real sobering thought. And but the feelings and the emotions and, the sense of, I guess, responsibility that some in the firearms industry have. And granted, it may be a lot of old timers, to an extent, but there is a feeling and a level of sense of responsibility that I think is getting harder and harder to find. In other words, this idea that, everyone wants to make sales, and every business wants to grow and have profit and make money. But there's other factors, guys, that are more important than the money, and more important than the profit. You just can't bring back a life. And it brings me back to a reality that I was thinking about before we decided to take a big dig and a deep dive into the Sig Sauer P320. Is until the Sig Sauer P320 was chosen as the United States military firearm, we had about 110 years of John Browning and Leon Hubert design work being carried by our military as far as sidearms. Of course, the 1911 for a very, very long time. And the Beretta 80, the Beretta 92, it's impossible to take a look at Leon Hubert's Browning BDA 380, which also, became, with a couple of differences, became the Beretta 84 and the 80 series. If you take a look at a Beretta 80 series pistol, and then you take a look at a schematic of a Beretta 92, and you take a look at these two, and you take a look at their parts and their systems and how they're put together and how they work, and you start to realize, without Leon Hubert's Browning BDA 380, which is also the Beretta 80 series, it would be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to ever get to a Beretta 92. So, for us, we call Leon Hubert a co-designer of the Beretta 92, which I think is, very accurate. And, but the point in this is, when we read John Browning's patents, and when, as Slav and I have come to know Leon Hubert, we have had such an appreciation for the realms that these guys operate in, that they think in. And one of the things that is very you can't miss this if you ever start reading John Browning's patents, his emphasis and focus on safety. And in other words, the firearm being a fully safe firearm. In other words, the user's hands and body are protected from any actions and mechanisms, and things like slide bite and hammer bite would have been unthinkable to John Browning, unthinkable to Leon Hubert as well. And these guys think at a level that anticipates that humans are going to screw this up, and they design in such a way to even have margin for the most normal screw ups. A lot of us, high power enthusiasts have thought for a long time that the magazine disconnect, was something that was put into the high power to really badger the trigger and make it terrible. And it was not. A lot of people are not aware that Browning's original patent for the 1911 included, guess what? A magazine disconnect. I know. We've all heard and been told different. It's been public record since like 1911. And he explained that the magazine disconnect, you have to remember, in these days, semi-auto pistols and a magazine-fed pistol, this is all new, very, very new technology. People are prone to be dubious of this and scared of it and wonder, is this safe? And and he was very conscious on making these firearms what he called perfectly safe. And the idea of a magazine disconnect is he was worried that people would have the belief mistakenly that when they drop out that magazine out of a handgun, that the magazine is then thereby unloaded. And all of us, I can remember, there was a time in my firearms knowledge and my evolution of firearms knowledge that I could have very easily made the same mistake and thought the same thing. And the magazine disconnect was in order to protect the user from making that mistake of believing they had fully unloaded the firearm because they had dropped the magazine. Okay, we're going to jump to some additional topics and a little additional subject matter, and we got a couple. James, hello, thank you for joining us. Chris, thank you for joining us. Mike, thanks for joining us, and all the BH team, and William, and folks watching this as a recording, which it will be available on YouTube as a post broadcast recording. Okay, we got some updates here about the SIG Sauer P320 and our adventures with that, with the High Power Medic. The High Power Medic is our partner FFL certified components installer, and works very closely with BHSpringSolutions as far as our technology and our prescriptions and things. And hopefully if you're watching this video, hopefully you have seen the 4 parts, which I admit get very, very, very long. And I want to apologize for, you may have noticed the way I've been talking today during this, sorry about that. The way I've been talking today during this live stream, you don't hear as much stuttering out of me, and ums and uhs and and so these negative speech habits that I've got. I get into those negative speech habits on a couple of different occasions very, very badly. One, when I know that material is going to be consumed by people who have the entire spectrum of knowledge. In other words, I know this is going to be listened to by folks who maybe just thought about owning a firearm, maybe, someday, and all the way to experienced armorers, gunsmiths, and fellow designers, and everything and everyone that spans in between those. And we want to make content that is comprehensible, is understandable, for all competency levels. And many times I get to presenting and talking, and what's going through my head is this going to come across in a way that anyone listening to this virtually is going to be able to understand the basics, at least the fundamentals, at least. So I'm always running things through, a filter like that. I will tell you that your streaming platforms today, particularly the one this is being recorded on, these are not the most First Amendment friendly environments. They're not the most First Amendment endorsing environments. And today, another filter that I have become too accustomed to using is what is this platform's AI going to do with what comes out of my mouth, and which is quite frankly scary sometimes. But trying to not create a reason, for something to be banned or something to get disappeared as far as content. And so those are the reasons, guys. I do have negative speech habits. I know I do. And this is lifelong, and I've given up on trying to overcome most of them. But the worst of it is when I'm filtering things and I'm imagining the broadness of the audience who's going to be listening to this, and wanting to make content that is not likely to set off alarm bells for primarily for AI. And that's the one that is probably the most concerning today. I did see just a day or two ago in our part one video of the 6 Sauer P320 series called Uncommanded Discharges Resolved, there was an AI generated summary of the video. And, so I saw that, and I'm at first I'm thinking, oh boy. And I read it, and I got to tell you, it was impressive. I mean, it was a very short, very concise, very to the point, much more to the point than myself in presenting that video. And it was scary accurate. This AI talked exactly about what this video is about. And how that happened, I don't know, but it was definitely impressive. So one of the things that we're starting to get conscious of it at almost a hyper level is virtually anything you post online, publish online, videos, writing, at a website, this is all being absorbed by artificial intelligence, and then turned around and applied, however it is. And the implications of that, quite honestly, when you start thinking about it, is a little disturbing, because it makes me want to almost, filter everything through, and, just how much do we really want AI to know? In other words, goodness, you can start to become, I don't know what you say, gun shy almost. Okay, the 6 Sauer P320. I can give you a couple of updates about this. We have had in about the last 6 weeks, 7 weeks, 8 weeks, the high power medic has seen a record number of 6 Sauer P320s, and I mean a record number as far as the number of firearms being serviced and modified in terms of a single model. We've always specialized a great deal in high powers, 1911s, CZ75s, Makarov pistols. We've also expanded in the last 6 months to cover. We will have spring kit products coming later this year, but to cover the high power medic in servicing every John Browning designed handgun of history and every Leon Hubert designed handgun of history. Those will all be eligible for servicing, spring change outs, tune-ups with the high power medic, and that's all of them. And I think a lot of people go, well, why in the world are you doing that? If you take a look at John Browning's handguns and his that were produced, and I'm speaking specifically of the FN 1900, the FN 1905 and 1906 vest pocket, the 1910, which also became the Browning 1955. Of course, the 1911, and then there was some Colt pistols, a 1903 and a 1908 and a 1908 vest pocket. All of these, and along with the 1911, all of these have certain attributes that I would challenge you to take a look around and see where these have been one-upped. And what I mean by that is size, weight, capacity, firepower in a package that is, I think you'll find, thinner. And when you start holstering something, especially if it's around your belt area, thinness of that firearm is everything in terms of comfort. I can take my high power out of a inside the waistband holster and put a SIG P320 in it, and I can feel that width difference. The SIG P320 is wider, and Browning had an understanding of what's going to make these things carryable, and what's going to be user friendly, and thinness of the profile of the firearm was a high priority for Browning. And my argument is just try to find firearms that are more comfortable to carry than those, as far as the bulk of them. One of the things that you run into, when you start polymer framing pistols, is you need to add weight in the slide. And that weight usually transfers to width, or, by necessity, or, because you have a polymer frame, you need a certain width in order for stability and so forth. And so these older handguns of John Browning's and Leon Hubert's have some advantages that are very, very difficult for any modern handguns, to compare to. So we expanded our coverage into those as well. We have been extremely, extremely impressed with the SIG Sauer P320. And I know that believe me, I know, and I'm starting to really understand now what a unicorn we are, because one of the things that when we started and we decided to look at the P320 and see is there places we can add margins of safety that can serve as basically mandates that consistent correct function will happen in this firearm. And the reason for that is because, obviously, if you've got firearms popping off when they're not supposed to be popping off, that is misbehavior. That is definitely not consistent correct function. So our goal always in any firearms model is consistent correct function. And so when we decided to take a look at that, we went through everything. I read, the FBI's entire 29-page, investigation and report, which, was really an opportunity, I have to tell you, because they had in that one, this was not left to speculation or conjecture or anything like that. They had this handgun still in the holster that was confirmed. Nobody touched the trigger. And as I understand it, the holster maker showed up. SIG didn't. The holster maker and their holster were cleared of any kind of, being a problem with this uncommanded discharge happening. And at the end of the day, they didn't really come up with anything. They just, said it's a defective pistol design. And, okay. So as we started looking at the SIG Sauer P320, it was sort of against that backdrop and a lot of other backdrops. But Guys, there are videos online that, are almost like a compilation of Sig Sauer P320 misbehaviors. And, I it's like there's this contingent of folks who, just want you to believe that you just can't believe your lying eyes when you see that. No, guys, this has happened too much. It has happened, and it's very, very difficult to watch a dozen or 2 dozen of these instances where it seems to be, there's no question that the handgun was not manipulated. There was not a hand near the firearm or the trigger, and it went kaboom. And so it was against that backdrop, that we started taking a look at the Sig Sauer P320. And we did not start taking a look at this handgun from the standpoint of, well, can we make a Sig Sauer P320 do that? I'm going to tell you in the best way that I can for public consumption. If we, with our knowledge, and when I talk about our knowledge, BH's knowledge, we are specialized in 2 specific areas: springs and handgun design. And that also follows what Leon Hubert is specialized in, among other things. And it's what our experience is in. And our collective knowledge and our knowledge base was really too perfect for taking a look at a handgun like the P320, because we looked at it from the very, very beginning. We never had a question, well, are these things misbehaving? Well, obviously, and for all the folks who, just don't want you to believe your quote lying eyes, and what you see, we didn't give that too much thought when a handgun that misbehaved like that is preserved and it's, gotten to the FBI and people want answers and so forth. That is a problem that is very much being perceived as real when you listen to recordings, of personnel and decision makers in police departments, and they go, "This is the 4th," and they've got a piece of carpet that's got a hole in it in a picture frame up on the wall, and now they're making a collection of these and stuff like that. And they're counting the numbers of these, uncommanded discharges they have. There's a point where you don't get stuck on things like, well, can we make this happen? Can we make this happen again? Can we make it happen 10 times out of 10? What I saw and what we saw was this was never happening the same way twice. It was being very, very unpredictable, but it was obvious that something's going on here. And our motivation from the very get-go was, can we add back margins of safety that will dictate, and I very much mean dictate or mandate, that these parts and components are going to consistently cooperate together correctly? Because if you have consistent, correct function, you don't have firearms misbehaving in the way that firearm has been. So I believe that we came at the Sig Sauer P320 from a different direction than anybody else had. We came at it from the standpoint of the guys who, along with our FFL partners, we have encountered so many old beater high powers and 1911s, and back in the early days when we really didn't know as much about what we're doing as today, and we would do dumb stuff like, well, this guy said he had a malfunction, let's go out and see if we can make it do it, or whatever. And you go out, you rack the slide, you let the slide go, and pow. or you let the slide go and pow, 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 and or whatever. I mean, which this is a dangerous firearm, and it's also uncommanded discharges, and it's also not consistent correct function. And we grew up on firearms doing things that they're not supposed to do and fixing that and correcting that. And in the instance of the example that I just gave you, the lion's share of the time, there's not enough pressure on the sear. The hammer is slipping the sear. And, and from that respect, it when you don't have enough sear pressure, and I'm going to reference, like the ATF has a definition for, high efficiency functioning, also known as, see if I can set the AI off on this one, full auto. Those are uncommanded discharges. And in the example that I just gave you, the FBI's definition is more than one shot per trigger pull. Well, if you have, degraded steer spring pressure, for example, in a 1911 or in an old high power, you don't even need a trigger. And I don't even know what you call that, because, it doesn't meet with the idea that it's more than one shot going per trigger pull, because, honestly, you could take the trigger out of one of those guns that are misbehaving that way and potentially empty the magazine with no trigger in the firearm whatsoever. However, these types of malfunctions are almost never have any kind of consistency to them. In other words, the next time you rack the slide and you let it go, and it doesn't go kaboom, and it acts like it should. And you shoot a couple magazines through it and everything seems cool. And you put another magazine in it and you pull the trigger once and it goes high efficiency, like, more than one round leaving per trigger pull. The nature of too little sear spring pressure is that it presents inconsistently, because the problem in and of itself is not having consistent correct function, having inconsistent and incorrect function. The antidote to that is consistent correct function, not the guy with his 1911 who can't figure out why this thing doubled or magazine dumped or fired on the slide going home or whatever. The guy who undertakes trying to, well, why did that happen? And he, wants to have, a concrete answer, for that. There is a concrete answer. But if he has a need to see that same malfunction happen again and again and again, exactly the same way, so he can believe there's a problem, that's not going to happen. Almost never. And so, we just did not approach this. I know how the FBI approached it. And I know the conclusion that they came up with, and it seems honestly very strange to be able to sit here and say, I don't agree with their conclusion that it's a defective firearms design. I have been carrying for about 4 weeks, 5 weeks, a Sig Sauer P320. And we showed that in part 4 that we just released. I think that was yesterday or the day before. And I've been carrying one in condition 1. I've been living with it. I've been holstering it. I've been, running around with it in a carry bag sometimes that gets dropped, set down kind of hard. This thing's not been babied anymore, than, the one that we now call the Beast, that we, threw off the house and drug down the road and everything. And I've not been babying that handgun in order to be comfortable with it. Now, I did remove a little bit of the back cover plate so that I can see the sear striker engagement that we affectionately call the main event. I do want to see, I call it training wheels for my trust. I want to see that full and expanded sear striker engagement area that we have prescribed for the Sig Sauer P320 is fully engaged. What I know is that when it is fully engaged, you can drop that off the house, drag it down the road, run over it with a car, and you cannot make it misbehave. And that was the whole point of, you know, our part one video. And we've not even released the footage yet, you know, of you know, why we were so sure, you know, uh, how do I put this? You know, when I was 19, I worked part-time as a roofer, and I would go up ladders and throw my leg over with 2 bundles of shingles on the shoulder and just keep going. And somewhere between then and now, I apparently decided I'd have a lot of stuff to live for. And when I get on heights like that, my legs don't hold up worth anything. And so for me to go up on a roof and start throwing a firearm off the roof, I got to have pretty high confidence that this thing is not going to let me down. And dragging it down the road and bouncing all over the place like we did, same way. We had duplicated sear spring pressure in the Sig Sauer P320 to the sear spring pressure that's typical in a Browning high power, which we have dropped and tested, and we have a lot of experience in that realm with the Browning high power. When you pull your manual safety off and the hammer is cocked on a Browning high power, with the manual safety off, the only thing holding that hammer to the rear is the pressure of the sear spring, just like a P320. Now, the difference in a P320 and a high power is when a high power, when you put the manual safety on, you have effectively blocked the sear. And when you put a manual safety on, if it has one in the P320, you're actually blocking the trigger bar. You still don't have anything going for you there. But we knew that this number, this, you know, about 4.3 to 4.5 pounds ish. And the way you measure that is you get a dynamometer and you press down far enough in order for the sear to clear the hammer or the sear to clear the striker. And you measure how much intensity is that. And it just so happens that we just about duplicated the intensity of the sear spring pressure on a high power, which we have a lot of reference points for what level of safety that that makes in a firearm. So we weren't just, you know, going off nothing, you know, when we started throwing this thing off the house. And you know, in part one, what you saw, in fact, the first testing that we were doing, the dropping we were doing was at 4 feet or higher, which is like, you know, the drop safety test that the Sig Sauer P320 originally failed with the U.S. military back in 2017. And, you know, we couldn't get misbehavior there. So we just decided to start upping it. And can we make this thing, you know, misbehave in some way? But again, this was coming at the problem from a direction that is like our DNA. It's like what we've been doing is, you know, for the last 10 years is creating more consistent and correct function in all of the handgun models that we serve. So an interesting, I'm going to be able to give you a visual here because we've not put this out yet on video. It's coming. But there was a video done by a gentleman who, he didn't mention BHSpringSolutions, but I think he was trying to make a point. And the point he made was interesting. And what he said is, you know, that the striker and the sear will stay engaged in a P320 without sear springs in the gun at all. And this was true, you know, to a point. They will. They're not going to stay together if you throw it off the house or bounce it down the road or run over with a car. Okay, that's not going to happen. However, he did show this on a video. And yes, there is an angle of the striker tooth and the sear that makes these two want to stay engaged. And we were kind of out ahead of that, you know, by a few weeks as far as his video, because Leon Hubert had suggested to Slav and me that you can increase that angle on the sear. And he gave us the exact, you know, degrees of angle that would be applicable, so that the striker and the sear want to hold together more, and it's going to increase the trigger pull more. And we didn't feel like we needed to go there because there's already an appropriate angle there. They actually did a pretty good job. But where I'm getting to is this: is if you've seen those videos and you've seen that schematic where you've got this sear, and we'll imagine this is the engagement face, and here's the striker bar coming to the sear. And if there are no sear springs at all in the P320, you can rack and you can rack and you can rack and you can rack, and you will not virtually ever see the striker and the sear engage. The striker just goes right on past the sear. Now, if you happened to have no sear springs in your P320 and you were shooting it upside down so that you've got gravity helping to keep that sear in the quote up position, but it would be in the down position in that case towards the slide, you can turn that pistol upside down, rack the slide, and that sear striker will engage every time. If you got it upright and you rack the slide and it goes forward, it never will. That is an exclamation point on how important the sear springs are in terms of that sear being where it needs to be when it's supposed to be there, because gravity sure can dictate it. In lieu of not having any sear springs in the handgun at all, gravity works. But this is kind of a, I don't know, a humorous way. Gravity still works. It's very effective. It is a force, and you have nothing mechanical going on inside the SIG P320 that dictates that sear is going to be where it's supposed to be, when it's supposed to be there, and stay there, other than springs. And our gentleman who apparently is an admirer of ours and released that video that said, that, well, the sear of the striker stay engaged even if you don't have sear springs. True enough. Nothing he said in that video is necessarily not true. The problem is engaging at all without manipulating the sear generally is not going to happen if you don't have sear springs in the handgun. But when you see this turned upside down, the slide racked, and then you take a look, and by golly, that sear striker is engaged reliably every time. What that shows you is mechanically there's nothing going on. The force of gravity is more persuasive than anything mechanical in that pistol, keeping the sear where it's supposed to be when it's supposed to be there. Because mechanically there's not anything that dictates that. It's all on the sear springs. So, okay. Wanted to mention also, for any folks who have not gotten this yet, at BHSpringSolutions.com, at our homepage, if you scroll down just a little bit, there's a button you can go to there. You can get a downloadable version at the bottom of the page. That opens at, it's the 9 safety margin add backs that we have prescribed and recommended for the SIG Sauer P320 as well. Do want to let you know a couple of other things about this subject as well. We now have those sear stabilizing sear springs for the SIG Sauer P320 in production in the United States, and as well as where my co-founding partner Slav lives in Bulgaria. And those are available for, and there's a lot of them actually, P320 owners in Bulgaria, and in the near future, Slav will be able to ship those to any users in Europe. Here in the U.S. market, we're making the springs here in the United States, and we are going to have an out-of-stock situation on those sear stabilizing sear springs. That out-of-stock situation probably is going to be happening right here in the coming week. Those springs are in production now, and we will be about 4 weeks that we will be in an out-of-stock situation. We fulfill all back orders as soon as we have a new supply of anything. So wanted to just mention that the response and the need for additional margins of safety in the P320 is such that it has been busy, and not only just for the springs alone, which are arguably the most important factor of the modifications that we have prescribed, but not the only one. But it is the standalone one most important one. I wanted to also mention that the high power medic, when he is intaking these P320s, there is a full stack of paperwork that is undertaken, checks, double checks, tests, and retests of a lot of things in the handgun, especially everything that relates to that positioning of the sear and the sear striker lockup. And it's a very regimented process. It is definitely not a situation where these things arrive and he's putting a couple springs in and making a modification to the sear and back out the door. It is a full gun servicing, and everything that you see in those 9 safety margin add backs are subject when those firearms are being serviced. And I'm going to take a look. We have some questions. What's going on with our supply of BH Advanced high power barrels? Those are in process, and we've actually got some things going on with a couple of different manufacturers for our technology. They are in process, and we will have more word about that mid to late next week ish. I'm going to take just a quick little pause here and read a couple of questions that I've got here in front of me on the chat. Okay, good question. If sear springs were the issue, I would think folks in the action pistol competition world would see way more uncommanded discharges, as this group frequently modifies the 320 with lighter springs. That's a good point. My partner Slav has in Bulgaria has a gentleman that he's very, very close to, who's a competition shooter. I think he also owns his own range. Over there, the CZ75 is very, very, very popular. Our CZ75 springs are something that the gentleman and his business endorse. And what I can tell you is competition shooters change their springs a lot. They go through a lot of springs. And, and honestly, as designer and manufacturer and purveyor of gun springs, I have to tell you, they're probably overdoing it. But who's to argue? I mean, these are also very, very successful shooters, and they want optimal. And I agree with that observation. It would seem counterintuitive that these guys lightening these springs would be having a lot more things going on than they do. I have to tell you, most competition shooters are the most spring changing people you're ever going to find. And it is not necessarily, I think if you take a look at our part 2 or part 3, it is not necessarily the sear spring pressure at the point of install. What we have found and what we have seen, and you can see online, and we have shown pictures, are these springs deforming and these springs losing their integrity. And Sig Sauer themselves calling their sear springs a consumable part that requires change. I believe their recommendation is every 3 years or 3,000 cycles. And their recommendation of 3,000 cycles, not 3,000 rounds, got my attention. Well, why would this matter? And this sort of what led us to the notion that, these springs are taking more impact than just a little bit of 1 millimeter or so of compression that's happening when you pull the trigger. That can't be working springs hard enough to cause deformation, and because, these things to be, as I think Sig says, optimal function will degrade, which means they're not going to work right. And competition shooters, the serious ones anyway, they don't take chances, guys, on tired springs. That is, at least that's been my experience so far. I know that the orders that have been received by us or by Slav over in Bulgaria, these are, you know, nice quantity orders of CZ75 springs. Um, you know, do I think people are wearing these things out, you know, that fast? I don't think so. Our springs are some of the most hardcore, longest lasting springs I've ever had my hands on. And they are, in fact. Um, but these guys, they don't take risks. They don't take chances. They take these guns apart religiously and they examine everything. If a spring is starting to get out of order, these guys know it. And can OEM springs keep this firearm from misbehaving if they are changed every 3,000 rounds? I'm not even going to speculate. There's not enough margin there for me to have that end of that barrel in condition one pointed at my body. You know, knowing that it only takes, say, 1.2 pounds to push that sear down against the pressure of those springs. My goodness, guys, you can pound up more than a pound, you know, of a handgun to make you know, something with that little amount of resistance move. The parts themselves are designed to cooperate correctly. As long as they're where they are supposed to be when they're supposed to be there, they will. And doing it with lighter sear springs, is it possible for that to be safe? Yes. I mean, parts that are made to cooperate together, yes, anything is possible. But competition guys, knowing these guys and how they jealously want healthy springs in their firearms when they're performing, you know, these guys would be, my argument would be, they would be the least likely to have misbehaviors. And that doesn't mean that they haven't happened in the competition realm or the competition world either, but I think they would be among the least likely. But it's because of their maintenance regimen that they undertake primarily. A spring, especially a sear spring, that is being given a forecast of 3 years or 3,000 cycles, and they come right out and tell you these are going to, the optimal function will degrade after that. This is on the edge starting out, guys. I mean, reminds me of you know, if you were to ask a roofer, you know, well, does that roof have at least 12 months of remaining useful life left on it? Good night. A roof shingle degranulates so little in 12 months that if you probably get a year. That's subject to leak at any time. It's on the edge. And what we have done is we have brought this away from the edge. Springs in applications that are prone to deform, that are prone to unwind themselves or buckle or bow. This is a spring that is trying to get itself out of its predicament. That's what springs do when they are doing a job that is bigger than they are. In order to hold a sear in place, you know, in a high power, you've got in order to hold a spring in place in a high power, you get this long flat metal spring. The darn thing can, you know, last 40 years, 50 years. And then we start hearing about 3 years or 3,000 cycles. We agree with SIG about their OEM sear springs. Yes, 3 years, 3,000 cycles. Yes, at least. When you're starting out with that level of sear spring pressure, yes, they need to be changed with that level of frequency. One of the things that I will also say is that with our suggestions, you know, of our 9 safety margin add backs, if the 4 million SIG P320s that are in existence now had been following that guidance, I don't think you have any instances of uncommanded discharge. Perhaps It's possible, even with the designed in amount of metal to metal overlap and the designed OEM steer springs with the rest of those safety margin add backs, it's possible you wouldn't have any instances of in this plague of kaboom also at all. That's yes, it is possible. Now, there's a difference between possible and probable. And from our standpoint, we look at this from the standpoint of, okay, is there any such thing as too much margins of safety? No. Is there any such thing as too prepared? No. Is there anything as too practiced? No. Is there any such thing as too focused? No. Is there anything such thing as too tactical? No. There's no such thing as too high of safety margins in a firearm. And the P320, the interesting thing, one of the most interesting things about the P320 is the design itself accepts our prescription for the sear springs. We don't need to alter anything. We don't need to make the place where they are installed deeper or change that dimension whatsoever. The design fully supports that. It has made me wonder if the original designer of the P320 did not intend for those or more robust sear springs to live there. That is an absolute possibility. There is not one of the things that made the situation with the P320 so very difficult is, yes, we can have more sear spring pressure. It's a higher margin of safety. It's going to give the sear more ability to be boss and keep authority over the goings on. Why wouldn't you want that? Why wouldn't you have that? The result is a very usable, very I consider a very good 5 to 5.5 pound trigger pull. I personally worry about having a handgun for defensive purposes that is less than that. But we've got plenty of BH veterans who are also attorneys, and I've heard again and again the last thing you want if you do have to use a firearm in a defensive shooting, and if this thing happens to go to a court situation, criminally or civilly, the last words you want any jury or any judge to ever hear are the words hair trigger. I can defend a 5 to 5.5 pound trigger pull, I think, all day, because it's just about what all of your law enforcement Glocks. It's just kind of a standard, I guess, if you will. It would be a very, very hard argument to make that a 5 to 5.5 pound trigger pull is a hair trigger. You don't want to be there. If you had to use that firearm defensively and things start getting under the microscope, you don't want a jury to hear those words ever at all, because I'm going to tell you right now, they'll never get them out of their head, and it will never not be a consideration. I can't even imagine it. Where we're seeing these P320s come in at, guys, these are rifle triggers. We have one of our dear friends is a retired Marine sniper, and we are getting P320s in, guys, with trigger pulls that are lower than his sniper rifle, his last sniper rifle was. This is crossing the streams. It's not I don't know even how to say it. It's for some applications, if you're knocking tin cans off a fence post at 100 yards, probably, that 2 3/4 pound trigger is probably going to be a productive thing and a help. Generally speaking, however, if you have never truly practiced
trying to dispense as many rounds as you possibly can, as accurately as you possibly can, and you're doing that in a sort of a competition, which, you know, my co-founding partner Slav and I, we've had a few friendly competitions with each other when I'm over in Bulgaria, and the last one that we had, I'm getting faster and faster, and I'm deholstering, and I get down to about 2.4 seconds, I think it was, to deholster and deliver 2 rounds to a lower target and 1 round to an upper target, and I was down to about 2.4 seconds, and this son of a gun deholsters from condition 3 appendix carry straight up, and he racks the slide. I can't make how he did it. Racks the slide and delivers 3 in like 2.2 seconds. And the faster I got, he just kept, one-upping me and kept one-upping me. If you've never tried to do that in a time situation where you're being timed and there's some stress of, trying to perform at a certain level, and if you've never tried to truly learn your reflexes and rapid fire, this is one of the most, it was a tremendously productive thing for me, because what I found out is if I'm working with a firearm that's anything less than about 4 3/4 pounds, and it needs to be about 5 3/4 for me, but if I'm working with anything less than about 4 3/4 pounds and I'm trying to rapid fire, you're always going to have a little bit of recoil. You're always going to have that timing. I will have rounds that will pop off just a microsecond sooner than I intended because of that lighter trigger. That's bad, guys. That is a bullet leaving my firearm before I wanted it to leave the firearm. And normally it's just so, so much of a microsecond that nobody else can even see it, but the target, where I've got one that either just didn't even show up because it went so high, because it was early. You want to know yourself, your reflexes, how they work with any particular firearm, and trigger pressure and reset authority, so that you can consistently be fast, productive, accurate, and most of all, under control. And, I would, we're seeing, P320s that are coming in with 2.5 pound triggers, 2 3/4 pound triggers, 3 pound triggers. And I consider myself a reasonably practiced person with a handgun. I need to be. Anytime I am on my way back to Bulgaria and Slav wants to get a hold of me and go show me who's boss, I'm all right. I'm better than average, I think. And but I know that with a trigger pull in that range, I can't control it as well as I can that, say 5.5, 5 3/4 pound trigger. So I want to take a look here at just some other questions. We're going to be wrapping this up, and we got a lot of interaction and activity here going on. Yes, William, he says he has a Gersan high power clone, a PI model. Yes, we just came out with BH advanced recoil spring guide rods for your PI model, and they also help keep your slide stop in the down position and not activating the slide, locking the slide back before the magazine is empty. Far easier to install, better recoil control, and if you go to BHSpringSolutions.com, and I believe you can go to BH Advanced Components, or just give us a call at 888-423-2477, which is BHSS. 877-423-BHSS or 2477. You're going to get a recorder there. You'll get a call back, and it'll be today. We're working, so nobody's going anywhere too far from home in this with this weather forecast going on out there. But yes, they're far easier to install in the PI models. It's specifically for your PI. It does not use that flat wire spring that Gersan used. It is full length guide rod, double spring over a spring, controls your recoil better, much easier to install. The springs um, have one of the things that we're seeing out of the PIs with their recoil spring equation is out of the box, we're getting extraction distances of empty shell casings at about 9 to 10 feet away from the shooting position. And that backs down to about 5 to 6 feet with our recoil spring guide rod in that model and with our recoil springs. And for anybody watching who does not understand, how far your extracting empty shell casings are going is one of the best gauges for how fast or not, or too fast or too slow your slide velocity is when your slide cycles. And what we call the sweet spot is really between about 4 feet and about 9 or 10 feet from the shooting position. The rationale there is if you're getting at least 4 foot extraction distance, you've got enough margin there. So if you do get to the, we call the dud in the box, or the weak round in the box that didn't get as much gunpowder as all the other ones did, you've got enough margin there that you probably will not short cycle if you get a weaker round in a box. And at the same time, not getting into what I call double digits, more than 9 feet or so, 10 feet away from the shooting position. It also keeps things from happening like, barrels unlocking before the bullets left the end of the barrel. That can happen, and it just plays hell with your accuracy when that happens, because you got a bullet leaving the end of a moving barrel. So in the design of our springs, we are always looking for any particular model, with either standard pressure ammunition or plus P or whatever it is. We're always looking for what we call the sweet spot area, which is approximately, say, extraction in the 4 to 8 foot range. This is maximum recoil control without running the risk of short cycling, so that you have the best control over the firearm. You're not running the risk of unlocking the barrel before the bullets left the end of the barrel, and you're not running the risk of short cycling. It's just what we call the sweet spot, if you will, that allows for both performance and reliability to be optimal. Why don't we see more closed and ground end springs in firearms? Seems like recoil springs especially are open on at least one end. A lot of them are. Virtually, I believe all of our recoil springs are closed at both ends, and we've had that as a standard in our designs. It was one of the very first things that we committed to when we first started designing springs and manufacturing them was we like closed end coils. And the reason that we like that, now granted, it's another step in the production, by the way, that closed end coil and it being sanded or ground flat on the end, that's additional step. Yes, it adds a little bit of cost to the production, but as compared to an open-ended coil, or what I call a cut coil, that cut coil tends to collapse or start to get closer to the next coil sooner than all the rest of the coils do, because it has no support. You've got support from one end, but you don't have support because it was cut there. Closing that end coil eliminates that weakness of that cut coil, of that would otherwise, basically it would have no support. But there are applications in some firearms in springs that are just not very stressed or hardworking at all. It doesn't really make any difference if you close the end of the coils or not. But specifically on recoil springs, your closed coil recoil springs typically will last longer. And okay, I want to see if I can find one more here. And guys, we're going to kind of be calling this to an end. Okay, got a gentleman here said, bought your steer springs for the P320. I feel much safer carrying this gun. It is more difficult to shoot with the heavier trigger, but that's something that can be trained. Yes, it can. And I want to tell you guys, as much as anybody, I am bad when it comes to when I feel a very light trigger on any firearm. I'm bad. I start having these visions of, shooting a whole magazine all through the same hole, just, unrealistic things like that. And I know how addictive light triggers are. And, I don't want to, come out and say that, that's the motivation behind, the prescription that's in the P320. These are very, very, very light triggers. Now, one of the interesting things, and we've not really talked about this or gone at, the SIG P320's trigger from this direction, but, we've had P320s, I should say the high power medic has had P320s that have come in, and he's measured, the trigger breaks, and he'll get, 2 3/4 pounds on a digital scale, and he'll get 5 pounds on an analog scale. And this is with, original OEM sear springs. And there's an illusion that's happening in this. And the illusion that's happening is the P320's trigger should have a small degree of over travel. In other words, trigger travel that is just past the break. And your finger doesn't care about the pressure in the over travel part. It already went kaboom. Okay. All you really care about is what type of finger pressure does it take in order to clear the striker from the sear. However, analog scales are very, very difficult. You pull through that separation of the striker and the sear with an analog, and whatever pull through after that in the over travel, that happens too when you do that trigger pull, and you're pulling into the strongest stage of the sear springs, but you're into the over travel. And your finger doesn't care about this. You're never going to feel that. You're going to feel the recoil at that point. And this is the little booger that can make a P320 sound like and look like it has a heavier trigger than it really does when it doesn't. You take that same handgun with our digital scale, our Lyman digital scale, and it comes in at say 2 3/4 or 3 pounds. The digital scale has a better ability to, I don't know how you say this, stop counting, I guess, when that abrupt jerk happens, when the trigger break happens. And you can differentiate between what is trigger pull and what is over travel. Normally, like for example, in the high power, you will have a very small, in high powers, a little bit of over travel. That over travel is totally benign. I mean, there's no resistance behind that. It cannot manipulate a trigger scale. You get into the over travel on a P320's trigger action, you're into the most compressed part of those springs because of the nature of the springs. And the over travel part is the heaviest part of the whole trigger. But this is not relevant, to what happens actually pulling the trigger. Getting through the break is the only thing your bullet and your finger, are ever really going to care about. We'll see if we have any more questions here. William, thank you very, very much. Appreciate your compliment about the audio. I was worried about that. We're new at this. Thank you for the compliment about this being a great chat. I do want everybody to know that my partner Slav actually probably would have joined us today, but we didn't have the software downloaded in time that would enable us to have multiple people on this chat. So very, very sorry about that, you guys. I do want to, there's one other thing that I want to just throw out in this video. It is something that, and then we're going to end this, but we have a Gen Z person, and actually, he's here today. He's our shipping department manager. And I think he just turned 25, if I'm not mistaken. And he's been with us now for maybe 3 years ish. And he told us one day, he said, Mark, we were, talking P320 and different things. And his comment was, man, my generation is just off the rails. And he said, everything, all they care about is, if it's full auto or a half-pound trigger or whatever. And guys, I know that the BH veterans are not made up of a crowd that is a lot of that. But I do want to make a suggestion. I do want to just throw this out there that we have some responsibility. The generations that have come, before Gen Z, the youngest generation now, we do have some responsibility here. A lot of our generations gave these kids cell phones and did not teach them things ourselves. And we need to, there is this sort of thinking in the Second Amendment community, I will call it the gun community, that any kind of restrictions or any kind of rules or any sort of oversight or anything like this is bad, and it's going to start there, and it's going to just take away your rights and so forth. I just saw a video today, Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I think it must have been a mayor or a city county council person or whatever, but apparently there's a law that got passed in Albuquerque, and the law is you can't have a firearm in public, concealed or not concealed, unless you're a firearm owner or unless you're a law enforcement person or a licensed security person. Our firearms rights are not safe. And the people in Albuquerque have got the Second Amendment too. Now, will that kind of a law stand? Probably not. It'll take a few years to get up to the Supreme Court, and it'll probably be struck down and maybe, to where it can't be anymore. But I think today about how much different some of our young people and the specific element that I'm talking about here, okay, is if I had the 3D printer and a simple blueprint or made one up myself, and I could make a device to go on the back of some popular handguns that can create high efficiency firing. We don't need a website to market that. We don't need videos to market that. We don't need advertising at all. And I'm sharing information with you here, not from the street, but from law enforcement friends. And this type of modifications, if you will, are so popular that you don't need to advertise them. You just need to let a few people know that you have them. The demand is that insane. And the desire for something like that to make a firearm function in a way that it was not designed or intended to function, and not even considering any of the repercussions of, you are making something function in a way that it was never designed or intended to be used that way. And, are there any safety concerns or anything? That is all out the window. That's not even a blip on the radar screen. It's this, for whatever we have bred into these kids, that high efficiency triggers or full auto function or half-pound triggers or whatever are some way to salvation or answer to your problems or, whatever. This is a big miss, and it's a bad reflection on us in a lot of ways, because for people to be taking the risks that they are taking, and there are risks involved with using firearms in ways and degrading triggers down to where the darn things almost, don't need a finger to pull the trigger at all, literally. Not because they're a P320, but because there's just no resistance on the trigger. and the zeal and the enthusiasm for this type of thing, it speaks volumes about a misbelief and a misdirection of where the mindsets have gone about certain things. And I will say that I consider it. I want to take some partial responsibility here for being a person who is speaking up and who is being forward with our young people and with Gen Z about real firearms responsibility and safety, and to the extent that it's possible, diffuse this enthusiasm for thinking that they're on a road to salvation because they have something that is that creates an illegal firearm, and like the risk of that is somehow worth it. Worth what? So you can do what? And I, again, I'm not trying to create an argument here. What I'm saying is the known, and this is very, 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 well known to the ATF, to the government, law enforcement, that the enthusiasm for things like this, it's almost as if, Gen Z grew up, they got phones and they got video games. And in the video games, when they got, an upgrade on a firearm or something in a video game, and, and it got them to a new high score or something. I don't know where some of these ideas have come from, but they are powerful and they stick. And what I am suggesting is that the responsible folks in the firearms community, I want to take partial responsibility for being an influence for this. I tell in the book, and hopefully this will inspire some of you to want to read the book, but there's a chapter. The title of the chapter is "Two 13-year-olds walk into a gun store, buy semi-auto shotguns and ammunition without their parents, and ride away on their bicycles." Guys, that was my father and his best friend in 1953. And the rest of the story is, and he bought his Browning Auto 5 shotgun that day. And the rest of the story is he traded in a Mossberg bolt action shotgun that he had bought at the same sporting goods store when he was 12. Guys, the rest of that story is he would take that shotgun in a case on the school bus. The school bus driver would put it behind the driver's seat. He knew that the school bus was locked up during the day. And the school bus driver would drop him off about 2 miles from his house, and he'd walk back the railroad tracks, and many afternoons bring home dinner, rabbits. He was rabbit hunting. And this was 13. He had a paper route, from the time I think he was 10, delivering newspapers. And he did this with his own money. And back in the day, we thought nothing about this, guys. And he insists to this day, nobody thought anything about this. But our young people, here he was, 13 years old, making his own money, getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning, delivering newspapers. He walks into a sporting goods store and wants to upgrade his shotgun because he's not, killing as many rabbits on the way home for dinner as he'd like. And it's not even considered a problem. We are not raising those kinds of people today, guys. And, I don't know who else's responsibility it is. If it's not ours, then whose is it? But we're not raising it that way today. And I want you to, you think about this. The last time I was around, a group of 13, 14-year-old, males in that age range, these were not, these were just kind of dopey acting kids. Definitely not somebody I would want going into a firearm store and being able to buy a firearm. And I'm not, promoting any idea that we need 12 and 13-year-olds buying firearms like my father and his friend were obviously able to. There's another trait, though, to his firearms ownership. And that was, he buys this Browning Auto 5 shotgun when he was 13. And the man never had another shotgun in his life until he was over 75 years old. But he became the most unbelievable rabbit hunter on a railroad track with that shotgun that I have never, ever seen duplicated. He was incredible, fast, reflexive, accurate, just unbelievable to me. How practiced he was. And I mean, this comes to another thing. Firearm skills that you develop that are truly reflexive, these are like riding a bicycle. They stick with you. I found that out. I'm 16, and this made my father around 45, I believe. We were walking down a railroad track one day because we got run out of the woods squirrel hunting because the mosquitoes were too terrible. And we walked about a mile down this railroad track, and we went home with 3 rabbits. And he killed 3 rabbits. And I had never done this before. And in all 3 cases, the last time, the third one, I barely got the shotgun to my shoulder. And he took 3 shots. We took home 3 rabbits. And I had never seen anybody perform like this. My father, again, when he was dating my mother, he goes to Kentucky where my great-grandparents lived. And my great-grandfather made an agreement with him that if my father went squirrel hunting, that my great-grandfather would clean the squirrels if he brought any back. He went with his .22 rifle. He comes back with 5 squirrels, and all 5 guys with a Marlin 39A, no scope, 5 headshots. I don't know if you've ever tried that before, but guys, that's pretty good. That's amazing. And, he, comes back and he's got 5 and all 5 of them are headshots. And, I mean, come on, on any given day, that would get anybody, a smack on the ass and a beer or, whatever. Right. And, after the squirrels got cleaned out in the woodshed, my great grandfather come back and he's got this funny look on his face along with the cleaned squirrels. He goes, "Where'd you learn to shoot squirrels like that?" And, my father's thinking, the smack on the ass and the beer's coming, right? And my great grandfather said, "I just want you to know you ruined the best part of all 5 of those squirrels." He wanted the brain. Yeah. So sometimes you just can't win, right? The thing I'm going for here, guys, is there was a time when the satisfaction of owning something and then the satisfaction of becoming truly efficient, proficient, effective, and reflexive with that was more important than owning 10 of them or 20 or 1,000 or whatever. And I'm not knocking, owning a lot of firearms. I enjoy my collection very much. But what I am saying is, we don't allow our 12 and 13-year-olds to walk into gun stores anymore and buy firearms, and rightfully so. But there was a level of guidance and there was a level of responsibility and supportiveness, I think, that our children were getting then that made it possible to have human beings at 12 and 13 years old that is missing today. And in all of our evolution, I don't think we've evolved. I think we've devolved. The last time I was around a group of, 13 or 14-year-old boys, no way do I want any of them handling any firearm. Frankly, without, an adult supervising. They're just, kind of dopey acting and some people would say acting their age, well, whatever, and then you see, I still remember that same day, this, 14-year-old gal that looks like she could pass for like a junior congressman, walks up and, very professional, well spoken, and, hi, how are you? It's very nice to meet you. And, like this, and not acting dopey at all. And I go, God, what happened to the guys? A lot of, well, I think it gets into too long of a discussion, but, I do want to say that, we all can impact a young person. And I am not ashamed, afraid, or backward about talking to them about some of the things that seem to be the most saleable things today, not legal, incredibly saleable, and practices today that are truly, truly unsafe, because it's like when you give somebody a recipe for lightening a trigger pull, oh my God, you can sell that one all day. And you don't need to advertise it or push it. You just have to say that, oh, it just lightens the trigger. The amount of misdirection that we are experiencing today is not something that's going to be affected by a law. It's not going to be changed by Big Brother. We and to an extent, it's up to us men. And I have affectionately a definition of a man. What is a man? I believe it encompasses three things. We protect our women and our families. We stop crime. And generally, we just want to be left alone so we can get our work done. Within that, definition of what is a man, our youngest generation can use some guidance. They can appreciate it. I can't imagine some of these young folks becoming, there's no downside to teaching. There's no downside to guidance. There's no downside to helping them become truly accurate and reflexive with legal firearms that are safe. There's a great amount of pride that happens in that. And, I saw it when I was 16, and my father, outshot me walking down a railroad track, 3-0, takes 3 shots, gets 3 rabbits. I don't know if you've ever tried that, no dog, whatever, weeds and shit growing up on both sides of the railroad track. You get maybe 2 hops. And to say that you're going to be leading this thing, goes without saying. You're going to be shooting out ahead of it. And he had this skill just down to a finely refined skill. Any legitimate skills that can be taught to young people, and the time taken with them, so they're not just running crazy. And with some of these crazy ideas, it's like I've talked to a couple, and it's like, my God, they think they have discovered some path to salvation or something, because they've found ways to make firearms do things that either they shouldn't do, or makes them just inherently unsafe. Folks, we can make a difference if we understand this problem, and we understand that there is a better way. We've already been there. We already lived it. We already set that example. Our generations before us did. From that standpoint, I'm not bashful about making content like this that hopefully can be passed on to young folks, or somebody that needs to hear it. And if somebody wants to debate any of these types of principles or things, I'd be more than happy to do that. I think it would be really fun to have a 18, 20, 22, 25 something year old who is very, very enthusiastic about some of these things join us as a guest on a live stream like this. And hopefully we'll get a chance to do that someday. Folks, thank everybody for joining us today. We wish you the very, very best wherever you are. If you're in the area that's going to be getting ice, please be very, very careful. 2/3 of the country is going to be getting affected by this today. So there's about a 67% chance you're listening to us. You are just bracing for impact. So, folks, thank you again. I'm Mark Allen, BHSpringSolutions LLC, BHSpringSolutions.com. On behalf of the High Power Medic, on behalf of my co-founding partner, Slav Baruchiev, our Chief Weapons Modifications Designer, Leon Hubert, and all of the BH personnel. Folks, thank you. Have a good weekend. Stay safe.